Before we dive deep into this compelling historical narrative, please take a moment to like this video. If you find it informative, subscribe to our channel for more in-depth World War II documentaries, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from around the world. We love connecting with our global community of history enthusiasts. The morning light of December 7th, 1941, would forever alter the course of human history, but the seeds of that fateful day had been planted years earlier in the corridors of power in Tokyo, where Japan's military and political leaders grappled with an increasingly impossible strategic situation. The attack on Pearl Harbor, known to the Japanese military leadership as Operation Z, or the Hawaii Operation, emerged not from aggressive expansion alone, but from a complex web of resource scarcity, diplomatic failure, and strategic miscalculation that would ultimately seal the fate of the Japanese Empire. In the autumn of 1941, Japan found itself in an economic stranglehold that threatened the very foundation of its military machine. The American oil embargo, implemented in response to Japan's occupation of French Indochina, had effectively cut off approximately 80% of Japan's petroleum supplies, creating what Japanese planners viewed as a ticking clock toward national collapse. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the Pearl Harbor strategy, understood better than most the implications of this economic warfare, having spent years studying in the United States and serving as Japan's naval attaché in Washington, D.C. His intimate knowledge of American industrial capacity and national character informed his strategic thinking in ways that would prove both brilliant and tragically flawed. The strategic context that gave birth to the Pearl Harbor operation can be traced to Japan's broader imperial ambitions and the doctrine of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. Since the early 20th century, Japan had been methodically expanding its influence across the Pacific, driven by a combination of resource necessity and imperial ideology. The nation's rapid industrialization had created a voracious appetite for raw materials that the Japanese home islands simply could not provide, particularly the oil, rubber, and metal ores essential for modern warfare. The Dutch East Indies, rich in petroleum and other critical resources, represented the crown jewel of Japan's territorial ambitions in what they termed the Southern Resource Area. However, Japanese military planners recognized that any move against the Dutch East Indies would inevitably draw the United States into the conflict, given America's strategic interests in the Pacific and its commitments to European allies. The U.S. Pacific Fleet, based at Pearl Harbor since May 1940, represented the single greatest threat to Japanese operations in Southeast Asia. Traditional Japanese naval doctrine, centered around the concept of kantai kessen, or decisive battle, had long envisioned a defensive posture in which the Imperial Navy would meet an advancing American fleet in Japanese home waters, after allowing submarines and land-based aircraft to wear down the enemy during their trans-Pacific journey. Yamamoto's revolutionary thinking challenged this defensive orthodoxy. He recognized that the traditional strategy of attrition and decisive battle might have worked against the Russian fleet in 1905, but would be inadequate against the industrial might of the United States. The admiral understood that Japan's only hope lay in achieving temporary naval supremacy in the Pacific, allowing sufficient time to seize and fortify the southern resource area before American industrial capacity could be fully mobilized for war. This realization led him to propose what many of his colleagues considered an impossibly risky gambit, a preemptive strike against the U.S. Pacific Fleet at its primary base. The genesis of the Pearl Harbor plan can be traced to early 1941, when Yamamoto first began exploring the feasibility of a carrier-based aerial attack on the Hawaiian naval base. The concept was inspired partly by the Royal Navy's successful torpedo attack on the Italian fleet at Taranto in November 1940, which demonstrated the devastating potential of carrier-based aviation against capital ships in harbor. However, adapting such tactics to Pearl Harbor presented unique challenges that would require months of intensive planning and preparation. Initial resistance to Yamamoto's proposal from the Naval General Staff was fierce and sustained. The staff officers responsible for overall naval strategy viewed the Hawaii operation as an unnecessary diversion of resources from the primary objective of securing the southern resource area. Their concerns were not without merit. The operation would require the commitment of Japan's entire first-line carrier force, leaving other operations potentially vulnerable to American counterstroke. Moreover, the technical challenges were daunting. Pearl Harbor's shallow waters made conventional aerial torpedoes ineffective, requiring the development of specialized weapons specifically designed for the attack. The diplomatic context surrounding the Pearl Harbor decision reveals the complex interplay between military planning and international relations that characterized Japanese decision-making in 1941. Throughout the year, Ambassador Kichisaburo Nomura and later Special Envoy Saburo Kurusu engaged in extensive negotiations with Secretary of State Cordell Hull, seeking a diplomatic solution that would allow Japan to retain its territorial gains while avoiding war with the United States. These negotiations, which came to be known as the Hull-Nomura talks, represented perhaps the last realistic opportunity to prevent the Pacific War. The Japanese position in these negotiations reflected the fundamental contradiction in their strategic thinking. While publicly expressing desire for peace, Japanese leaders were simultaneously preparing for war, having committed themselves to the southern operation regardless of diplomatic outcomes. The Japanese negotiating position, embodied in what they called Draft B, sought American acceptance of Japan's dominant position in China and Indochina in exchange for limited concessions. This proposal, delivered to Hull on November 20, 1941, represented Japan's final attempt at a negotiated settlement. The American response, delivered on November 26 in the form of the Hull Note, effectively ended any possibility of diplomatic resolution. Hull's 10-point proposal demanded complete Japanese withdrawal from China and Indochina, restoration of Chinese sovereignty, and abandonment of the Axis alliance with Germany and Italy. From the Japanese perspective, these demands represented not just the abandonment of their imperial project, but a return to the international isolation they had fought to escape since the Meiji Restoration. The Hull Note was perceived in Tokyo as an ultimatum that would destroy the fruits of the China incident, endanger Manchukuo, and undermine Japanese control of Korea. The psychological impact of the Hull Note on Japanese leadership cannot be overstated. Emperor Hirohito, who had previously shown reluctance to approve military action against the United States, became more actively involved in war planning after receiving news of the American position. According to contemporary accounts, the emperor openly displayed happiness upon hearing about the success of the surprise attacks, suggesting that even Japan's traditionally cautious head of state had come to view conflict as inevitable. With diplomacy effectively exhausted, Japanese attention turned fully to military preparation. The final approval for the Pearl Harbor operation came only after extensive war games and strategic assessments conducted throughout the autumn of 1941. These exercises, held at the Naval War College, attempted to simulate the various scenarios and challenges associated with the Hawaii operation. The results were sobering, revealing that success depended heavily on achieving complete surprise, and that even under optimal conditions, the operation carried significant risks. The strategic objectives of the Pearl Harbor attack, as conceived by Yamamoto and refined by his planning staff, were both ambitious and limited. The primary goal was the neutralization of American naval power in the Pacific, specifically the battleships and aircraft carriers of the Pacific Fleet. By crippling American naval capability, Japanese planners hoped to create a window of opportunity lasting 6 months to a year during which they could seize and fortify their objectives in Southeast Asia. The attack was never intended as the opening move in an invasion of Hawaii or the American mainland, but rather as a defensive measure designed to protect Japanese operations elsewhere in the Pacific. However, the strategic logic underlying the Pearl Harbor attack contained fundamental flaws that would ultimately prove fatal to Japanese war aims. Yamamoto himself understood that the operation could only delay, not prevent, American entry into the Pacific War. His famous prediction that Japan could run wild for 6 months or a year reflected his understanding that American industrial capacity would ultimately prove decisive in any prolonged conflict. The attack thus represented a desperate gamble, based on the hope that early Japanese victories would convince the American public to accept a negotiated peace favorable to Japan. The selection of Pearl Harbor as the primary target reflected careful analysis of American naval deployment and strategic priorities. By 1941, the forward basing of the Pacific Fleet in Hawaii had concentrated approximately 70% of American naval power in the Pacific at a single location. This concentration, originally intended as a deterrent to Japanese aggression, actually created an opportunity for a decisive blow that could temporarily neutralize American naval power throughout the region. The Japanese correctly assessed that destruction or severe damage to the Pacific Fleet would require months or years to repair, during which time Japanese operations in Southeast Asia could proceed without significant naval interference. The technical and logistical challenges associated with mounting an attack across 3,500 miles of Pacific Ocean required innovative solutions and meticulous preparation. The Japanese task force, designated the First Air Fleet, would need to approach Pearl Harbor undetected, launch a coordinated air assault, and withdraw before American forces could mount an effective counterstroke. The operation demanded not only tactical excellence, but also strategic deception on a scale rarely attempted in naval warfare. Intelligence gathering for the Pearl Harbor operation began months before the attack, with Japanese agents in Hawaii providing detailed information about fleet movements, base defenses, and operational patterns. This intelligence network, centered around the Japanese consulate in Honolulu, provided regular updates on the composition and location of American naval forces, enabling Japanese planners to time their attack for maximum effect. The intelligence revealed that American forces followed predictable routines, with the fleet typically in port on weekends, and defenses relaxed during peacetime conditions. The question of alternative strategies has long fascinated historians studying the Pearl Harbor decision. Could Japan have achieved its strategic objectives without attacking Pearl Harbor? The answer reveals the limited options available to Japanese leadership in 1941. A direct assault on the Dutch East Indies without neutralizing the Pacific Fleet would have exposed Japanese forces to attack from both the Philippines and Hawaii, potentially resulting in the destruction of Japan's limited naval resources before the southern operation could be completed. Similarly, a purely defensive strategy would have allowed American industrial capacity to overwhelm Japanese forces through sheer material superiority, an outcome Yamamoto was determined to prevent. The role of Emperor Hirohito in approving the Pearl Harbor attack remains a subject of historical debate, but contemporary documents suggest a more active involvement than previously understood. While the emperor traditionally remained above direct military planning, the crisis of 1941 drew him into unprecedented participation in strategic decision-making. His final approval of the operation on December 1, 1941, came only after extensive consultation with military and political advisors who unanimously recommended war as preferable to accepting American demands for complete withdrawal from the Asian mainland. The psychological dimensions of the Pearl Harbor decision reflect broader patterns in Japanese strategic thinking that would influence the conduct of the entire Pacific War. The concept of Yamato Damashi, or Japanese spirit, suggested that moral and spiritual factors could overcome material disadvantages in warfare. This belief system, deeply rooted in Bushido traditions and reinforced by Japan's previous military successes against China and Russia, contributed to a dangerous underestimation of American resolve and capability. Japanese leaders convinced themselves that a sharp, decisive blow would shock the American public into accepting Japanese domination of East Asia rather than mobilizing for a prolonged and costly war. The economic factors driving the Pearl Harbor decision cannot be separated from the broader context of Japanese imperial expansion and resource acquisition. By 1941, Japan's war machine consumed approximately 12,000 barrels of petroleum daily, with reserves sufficient for only 18 months of intensive operations. The American oil embargo had reduced this timeline to perhaps 6 months, creating what Japanese planners viewed as an existential crisis requiring immediate action. The southern resource area, particularly the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, offered the only realistic solution to Japan's energy crisis, but securing these resources required neutralizing American naval power in the Pacific. The timing of the Pearl Harbor attack reflected careful calculation of seasonal and operational factors that would maximize Japanese advantages while minimizing American capabilities. December offered optimal weather conditions for the trans-Pacific voyage, while the weekend timing was designed to catch American forces at their most vulnerable. Japanese intelligence had identified Sunday morning as the period when American defenses were most relaxed, with many personnel on liberty and ships operating with reduced crews. This attention to tactical detail reflected the thoroughness of Japanese planning, even as strategic assumptions proved fatally flawed. As 1941 drew to a close, the die had been cast for one of history's most consequential military operations. The Japanese First Air Fleet, under the command of Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, had begun its secret journey across the North Pacific, carrying the hopes and fears of an entire nation toward a rendezvous with destiny in Hawaiian waters. The strategic calculations, diplomatic failures, and military preparations of the preceding months had culminated in a plan that would either secure Japan's position as the dominant power in East Asia or set in motion the forces that would ultimately destroy the Japanese Empire. The success or failure of Operation Z would determine not just the outcome of the Pacific War, but the entire course of the 20th century. In the austere confines of his flagship Nagato, anchored in the grey waters of Hiroshima Bay, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto contemplated a strategy that would either crown him as one of history's greatest naval tacticians or condemn him as the architect of Japan's destruction. The man who would conceive and champion the Pearl Harbor operation was a study in contradictions, a traditionalist who embraced radical innovation, a nationalist who understood America better than most Americans, and a warrior who privately opposed the very war he would help initiate. His complex personality and strategic vision would shape not only the planning of Operation Z, but the fundamental character of Japan's approach to the Pacific War. Yamamoto's path to naval command had been forged in the crucible of Japan's modernization and expansion. Born in 1884 in rural Niigata Prefecture, he had witnessed Japan's transformation from feudal isolation to industrial power, participating in the great naval victory over Russia at Tsushima in 1905 as a young ensign. That battle, in which Admiral Togo's fleet had annihilated the Russian Baltic Fleet, became the template for Japanese naval thinking and would profoundly influence Yamamoto's own strategic concepts. However, his later experiences in America as a student at Harvard University and as naval attaché in Washington had given him a perspective on American industrial capacity and national character that few of his contemporaries possessed. The strategic environment confronting Yamamoto in 1941 differed fundamentally from the conditions that had enabled Japan's previous naval triumphs. Unlike the declining Russian Empire of 1905, the United States represented a vibrant industrial democracy with virtually unlimited capacity for military production once fully mobilized. Yamamoto's famous observation that Japan could run wild for 6 months or a year reflected his understanding that any conflict with America would ultimately be decided by material factors rather than spiritual or tactical superiority. This realization led him to conclude that Japan's only hope lay in achieving such decisive early victories that the American public would prefer negotiated peace to prolonged warfare. The conceptual foundation of the Pearl Harbor attack can be traced to Yamamoto's revolutionary approach to naval strategy, which departed radically from the defensive thinking that had dominated Japanese naval planning since the Russo-Japanese War. Traditional Japanese doctrine, embodied in the concept of Kantai Kessen, envisioned a defensive strategy in which enemy fleets would be worn down during their approach to Japanese waters before being destroyed in a climactic battle. This approach had worked against Russia, whose fleet had traveled halfway around the world and arrived in Japanese waters exhausted and demoralized. But Yamamoto recognized that it would be inadequate against the United States. The American threat was fundamentally different from anything Japan had previously faced. The U.S. Pacific Fleet, based at Pearl Harbor since May 1940, represented not just a collection of warships, but the forward edge of American industrial power projected across the Pacific. Moreover, the fleet's advanced position in Hawaii placed it within striking distance of Japanese operations throughout Southeast Asia and the Central Pacific. Any Japanese move against the Dutch East Indies or the Philippines would face immediate interference from Pearl Harbor-based forces unless the American fleet could be neutralized at the outset of hostilities. Yamamoto's strategic innovation lay in recognizing that Japan's traditional advantages in night fighting and torpedo warfare would be meaningless if American industrial capacity was allowed to reach full mobilization. The admiral understood that Japan possessed temporary superiority in carrier aviation and naval air power, advantages that would quickly evaporate as American shipyards began producing Essex-class carriers and American training programs expanded pilot production. The window of opportunity for Japanese action was therefore extremely limited, measured in months rather than years. The inspiration for the Pearl Harbor attack came from multiple sources, but the British carrier raid on Taranto in November 1940 provided the immediate tactical model. In that operation, 21 Swordfish torpedo bombers from the carrier, HMS Illustrious, had attacked the Italian fleet in Taranto harbor, sinking 3 battleships and severely damaging others with minimal losses. The attack demonstrated that carrier-based aircraft could achieve decisive results against heavily defended naval bases, provided they achieved tactical surprise. Yamamoto and his planning staff studied the Taranto raid intensively, adapting its lessons to the unique challenges presented by Pearl Harbor. However, the differences between Taranto and Pearl Harbor were as significant as the similarities. Pearl Harbor was located 3,500 miles from the nearest Japanese base, requiring a carrier task force to operate independently for weeks without logistical support. The harbor itself was much shallower than Taranto, making conventional torpedo attacks extremely difficult. American defenses were also more sophisticated, including radar installations and significant numbers of fighter aircraft. These challenges required innovative solutions that pushed Japanese naval technology and tactics to their absolute limits. The development of specialized weapons for the Pearl Harbor attack revealed the extent of Japanese technological innovation and industrial capability in 1941. The shallow waters of Pearl Harbor, averaging only 40 feet in depth, rendered standard aerial torpedoes useless. as they would simply bury themselves in the harbor bottom after being dropped from aircraft. Japanese ordnance specialists solved this problem by developing modified Type 91 torpedoes equipped with wooden fins that allowed them to run in shallow water without diving too deeply. These modifications, combined with specially trained pilots capable of extremely low-level attacks, gave Japanese forces a capability that American defenders had dismissed as impossible. Similarly, the development of armor-piercing bombs capable of penetrating battleship deck armor required extensive metallurgical research and testing. Japanese engineers modified 16-inch naval gun shells, adding fins and fusing mechanisms to create weapons capable of penetrating the heavily armored decks of American battleships. These improvised but effective weapons would prove devastatingly successful against ships like the USS Arizona, whose destruction became the enduring symbol of the Pearl Harbor attack. The selection and training of personnel for Operation Z reflected Yamamoto's understanding that the success of such a complex operation depended entirely on human factors. The admiral personally selected Commander Mitsuo Fuchida to lead the aerial attack, recognizing the need for exceptional leadership and tactical expertise in coordinating over 350 aircraft from 6 different carriers. Fuchida's selection was based not only on his flying skills, but also on his ability to maintain formation discipline and tactical coordination during the stress of combat operations. The training program for Pearl Harbor pilots was conducted under conditions of extraordinary secrecy at remote bases throughout Japan. Pilots practiced low-level bombing and torpedo attacks against mock targets that replicated the layout of Pearl Harbor, with particular attention to the shallow water torpedo techniques that would be crucial to the operation's success. The training was so realistic that American intelligence would later discover detailed scale models of Pearl Harbor and its defenses in captured Japanese materials, testament to the thoroughness of Japanese preparation. Yamamoto's strategic thinking extended beyond the immediate tactical objectives of the Pearl Harbor attack to encompass broader questions of war termination and political objectives. The admiral understood that military victory alone would be meaningless unless it achieved political results that served Japanese strategic interests. His concept for the Pearl Harbor operation was therefore embedded within a larger strategic framework that envisioned rapid Japanese expansion across the Pacific, followed by negotiated peace with a shocked and demoralized United States. This strategic vision reflected both the strengths and limitations of Japanese strategic thinking in 1941. On one hand, Yamamoto correctly assessed the temporary nature of Japanese military advantages and the need for rapid decisive action before American industrial superiority could manifest itself. His emphasis on carrier aviation and offensive operations represented advanced thinking that was ahead of its time compared to the battleship-focused doctrines still prevalent in other navies. However, his assumption that the American public would accept defeat rather than mobilize for total war revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of American political culture and national character. The relationship between Yamamoto and the Naval General Staff throughout the Pearl Harbor planning process illuminates the complex dynamics of Japanese military decision-making in 1941. The staff officers responsible for overall naval strategy remained skeptical of the Hawaii operation, viewing it as an unnecessary diversion from the primary objective of securing the southern resource area. Their preference for a more conservative approach, focusing defensive resources on protecting Japanese advances in Southeast Asia, reflected traditional naval thinking that prioritized the protection of existing assets over the destruction of enemy capabilities. Yamamoto's response to this resistance revealed both his strategic acumen and his willingness to stake his career on his convictions. In a famous ultimatum delivered to the Naval General Staff, The admiral threatened to resign his command unless the Pearl Harbor operation was approved as an integral part of Japan's war plans. This confrontation represented more than a disagreement over tactical details. It reflected fundamentally different philosophies about the nature of warfare and the requirements for Japanese victory against the United States. The admiral's threat to resign carried particular weight because of his reputation as Japan's most competent naval commander and his unique understanding of American capabilities. His colleagues recognized that Yamamoto's departure would deprive Japan of its most experienced and innovative strategic thinker at the moment when such leadership was most desperately needed. Faced with this ultimatum, the Naval General Staff reluctantly agreed to incorporate the Pearl Harbor attack into Japan's overall war plan, though their skepticism would persist throughout the planning process. The detailed planning for Operation Z began in earnest during the spring and summer of 1941, with Yamamoto delegating operational responsibility to Rear Admiral Ryunosuke Kusaka and Commander Minoru Genda. These officers, working closely with Yamamoto's Deputy Chief of Staff, Captain Kameto Kuroshima, developed the tactical framework that would guide the Pearl Harbor attack. Their planning process was characterized by meticulous attention to detail and innovative thinking about the application of carrier aviation to strategic objectives. Genda's role in the planning process was particularly significant, as his expertise in naval aviation made him the ideal officer to translate Yamamoto's strategic vision into operational reality. Genda had been one of the pioneers of Japanese carrier doctrine, advocating for massed carrier operations and coordinated airstrikes that departed from the traditional Japanese emphasis on individual ship actions. His tactical concepts for the Pearl Harbor attack emphasized concentration of force and simultaneous attacks on multiple targets, principles that would maximize the psychological and material impact of the operation. The selection of targets within Pearl Harbor reflected careful analysis of American naval capabilities and the requirements for achieving lasting damage to the Pacific Fleet. Japanese planners identified the aircraft carriers as the primary strategic targets, recognizing that these ships represented the most significant threat to Japanese operations throughout the Pacific. However, intelligence indicated that the carriers were frequently absent from Pearl Harbor, leading to contingency planning focused on battleships and other capital ships as secondary targets. The emphasis on battleship targets reflected both the strengths and limitations of Japanese strategic thinking in 1941. While battleships remained important symbols of naval power and possessed significant capability for shore bombardment and fleet actions, their strategic value was declining in an era of carrier-based warfare. Yamamoto and his planners understood this transition intellectually, but their target selection still reflected traditional assumptions about the centrality of battleships to naval operations. This focus on battleship targets, while tactically successful, would ultimately prove less strategically significant than the planners hoped. The logistical challenges associated with mounting Operation Z across 3,500 miles of Pacific Ocean required innovative solutions and careful coordination with Japan's limited naval resources. The task force would need to operate independently for nearly a month, requiring careful planning for fuel, provisions, and ammunition. The route selected for the approach to Hawaii took advantage of the North Pacific's winter weather patterns, which provided cloud cover and reduced the likelihood of detection by American or neutral shipping. The departure of the Japanese task force from Hitokapu Bay in the Kuril Islands on November 26, 1941, marked the point of no return for Yamamoto's strategic gamble. The fleet that sailed into the gray North Pacific waters represented the concentrated power of the Imperial Japanese Navy: 6 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, 2 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, 9 destroyers, and 3 submarines, carrying a total of 414 aircraft and 31,000 personnel. The scale and composition of this force reflected both the ambition of Japanese planning and the enormous risks associated with concentrating so much naval power in a single operation. The Strategic Communications Plan for Operation Z revealed Yamamoto's attention to both tactical and political considerations. The attack was timed to begin approximately 30 minutes after the formal delivery of Japan's declaration of war to the American government, providing a veneer of international legal compliance while maintaining tactical surprise. This timing reflected Japanese concerns about avoiding the stigma of a completely unprovoked attack, though the practical effect was to create the appearance of treachery that would galvanize American public opinion against Japan. Yamamoto's personal involvement in the final preparations for Pearl Harbor demonstrated his understanding of the operation's significance for Japan's entire war effort. Unlike many naval commanders who delegated operational details to subordinates, the admiral remained intimately involved in planning and preparation, personally reviewing intelligence reports and tactical assessments until the moment of departure. His hands-on approach reflected both his natural leadership style and his recognition that the Pearl Harbor attack represented the most critical operation of his career. The psychological dimensions of Yamamoto's strategic thinking reveal the complex interplay between rational analysis and cultural assumptions that characterized Japanese planning for the Pacific War. While his assessment of American industrial capacity was remarkably accurate, his evaluation of American political will and national character proved fatally flawed. The admiral's assumption that decisive military defeat would convince the American public to accept negotiated peace reflected a failure to understand the democratic political systems and national ethos that would drive American war mobilization. The question of alternative strategies available to Japanese leadership in 1941 highlights both the strengths and limitations of Yamamoto's strategic vision. Could Japan have achieved its objectives without attacking Pearl Harbor? The admiral himself had considered various alternatives, including a purely defensive strategy focused on fortifying existing positions and a limited offensive aimed only at the Dutch East Indies. However, his analysis convinced him that these alternatives would merely delay inevitable defeat rather than creating conditions for Japanese victory. The defensive alternative suffered from the fundamental problem of allowing American industrial superiority to manifest itself over time. Japanese naval production in 1941 was already struggling to match American shipbuilding, and the gap would only widen as American war production reached full capacity. A defensive strategy might have prolonged the conflict, but it offered no realistic prospect for achieving Japanese war aims or forcing American acceptance of the new order in East Asia. Similarly, a limited offensive against only the Dutch East Indies would have left American naval power intact and capable of interdicting Japanese operations throughout the Pacific. The U.S. Pacific Fleet, operating from both Hawaii and the Philippines, could have strangled Japanese lines of communication and supply, making it impossible to hold the conquered territories against American counterstroke. Only by neutralizing American naval power at the outset of the war could Japan hope to create sufficient time and space to consolidate its conquests. The role of technological factors in Yamamoto's strategic calculations reveals his sophisticated understanding of the material basis of modern warfare. The admiral recognized that Japan's temporary advantages in naval aviation, torpedo warfare, and night fighting capabilities provided a narrow window of opportunity that would quickly close as American industry reached full mobilization. His emphasis on achieving decisive results within the first 6 months of war reflected this understanding of technological and industrial realities rather than mere optimism or cultural bias. The integration of Operation Z within Japan's broader strategic framework demonstrated Yamamoto's appreciation for the complexity of modern warfare and the need for coordinated action across multiple theaters. The Pearl Harbor attack was never conceived as an isolated operation, but rather as the opening move in a carefully choreographed sequence of operations that would secure Japanese domination throughout the Pacific. The simultaneous attacks on the Philippines, Hong Kong, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies were all dependent on the success of the Pearl Harbor operation in neutralizing American naval interference. As the Japanese task force disappeared into the vast emptiness of the North Pacific, Yamamoto remained aboard his flagship in Japanese waters, monitoring the progress of the operation through carefully coded radio transmissions. The admiral understood that the success or failure of Operation Z would determine not only the outcome of the Pacific War, but also his own place in history. The strategic vision that had driven him to champion the Pearl Harbor attack, despite fierce opposition from his colleagues, was about to face the ultimate test of combat. In the pre-dawn darkness of December 7, 1941, as Japanese aircraft began launching from their carriers 230 miles north of Oahu, the culmination of Yamamoto's revolutionary strategy was finally at hand. The success of any military operation depends ultimately on the countless details of planning, training, and preparation that transform strategic vision into tactical reality. For the Pearl Harbor attack, this process began in the early months of 1941 and continued with increasing intensity until the moment Japanese aircraft lifted off from their carriers on the morning of December 7th. The transformation of Admiral Yamamoto's bold concept into a practical military operation required innovations in tactics, technology, and training that pushed the Imperial Japanese Navy to the very limits of its capabilities. The initial planning phase for Operation Z presented challenges that had never before been attempted in naval warfare. The target lay 3,500 miles from the nearest Japanese base, requiring a carrier task force to operate independently for nearly a month without the possibility of reinforcement or resupply. The approach route would take Japanese ships through some of the most desolate and storm-swept waters in the Pacific, where winter weather patterns could either provide concealment or destroy the entire operation through meteorological catastrophe. These logistical and navigational challenges required careful coordination between multiple naval specialties and represented a quantum leap in the complexity of carrier operations. The selection of approach routes reflected sophisticated analysis of weather patterns, shipping lanes, and American patrol activities throughout the North Pacific. Japanese planners identified a corridor roughly following the 42nd parallel north that offered optimal concealment while avoiding the major commercial shipping routes between North America and Asia. This route took advantage of the North Pacific's notorious winter storms, which would provide cloud cover and reduce visibility, but also create dangerous seas that tested the seamanship of Japanese crews. The final approach to Hawaiian waters required precise navigation and timing to position the task force within aircraft range of Pearl Harbor, while remaining undetected by American reconnaissance flights. The development of specialized weapons and equipment for the Pearl Harbor attack demonstrated the innovative capacity of Japanese military technology in 1941. The most significant challenge involved adapting aerial torpedoes for use in the shallow waters of Pearl Harbor, which averaged only 40 feet in depth compared to the 75-foot minimum depth required for standard torpedo operations. Japanese engineers solved this problem through a combination of wooden fins and gyroscopic stabilizers that prevented the torpedoes from diving too deeply after being dropped from aircraft. These modifications required extensive testing and refinement, with pilots practicing attacks against mock targets in similar shallow water conditions throughout Japan. The armor-piercing bombs developed specifically for the Pearl Harbor attack represented another triumph of Japanese military engineering. Standard aerial bombs lacked the penetrating power necessary to damage heavily armored battleships, leading Japanese ordnance specialists to modify 16-inch naval gun shells for aerial delivery. These improvised weapons, equipped with special fins and delayed action fuses, could penetrate several inches of deck armor before exploding within the target ship. The development process required careful attention to aerodynamics, metallurgy, and explosive chemistry, fields in which Japanese engineers demonstrated remarkable expertise. The training program for Operation Z began in the spring of 1941 at remote bases throughout Japan, conducted under conditions of extraordinary secrecy. Pilots selected for the operation underwent intensive preparation that included low-level bombing, shallow-water torpedo attacks, and formation flying under combat conditions. The training was so realistic that detailed scale models of Pearl Harbor and its surrounding terrain were constructed to allow pilots to familiarize themselves with their targets before the actual attack. These models, based on intelligence gathered over many months, reproduced every significant feature of the Hawaiian naval base with remarkable accuracy. The intelligence-gathering operation that supported Pearl Harbor planning represented one of the most sophisticated espionage efforts of the early war period. Japanese agents in Hawaii, operating both through the consulate in Honolulu and independent networks, provided regular reports on fleet movements, base defenses, and operational patterns. This intelligence revealed that American forces followed predictable routines, with most ships in port during weekends and defensive preparations relaxed during peacetime conditions. The intelligence network also identified the locations of key facilities, such as fuel storage tanks, ammunition depots, and aircraft maintenance hangars that would become secondary targets during the attack. The selection and organization of the task force for Operation Z required careful balance between offensive capability and operational security. The core of the striking force consisted of 6 aircraft carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, representing virtually the entire first-line carrier strength of the Imperial Japanese Navy. These ships carried a total of 414 aircraft, including fighters, dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and reconnaissance planes, providing the concentrated air power necessary to overwhelm American defenses at Pearl Harbor. The supporting elements of the task force reflected the complex logistical requirements of long-range naval operations. 2 battleships, Hiei and Kirishima, provided heavy escort and shore bombardment capability if required. 2 heavy cruisers and 1 light cruiser added anti-aircraft defense and reconnaissance capability, while 9 destroyers provided screening and anti-submarine protection. 3 submarines operated independently to gather intelligence and provide early warning of American countermeasures. 8 tankers accompanied the task force to provide fuel for the long voyage, while supply ships carried provisions, ammunition, and spare parts for the entire operation. The command structure established for Operation Z reflected the careful attention Japanese planners devoted to coordination and control during complex multi-ship operations. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo commanded the overall task force, with tactical control of air operations delegated to experienced carrier commanders such as Captain Mitsuo Fuchida. This arrangement combined strategic oversight with tactical expertise, allowing senior commanders to focus on broad operational objectives while leaving detailed execution to specialists in carrier warfare. The communications plan for the Pearl Harbor attack addressed both operational coordination and strategic deception. Radio silence was maintained throughout the approach to Hawaii, with ships communicating through signal flags and searchlights to avoid detection by American radio intercept stations. However, elaborate deception measures were implemented in Japanese home waters, including fake radio traffic designed to suggest that the carrier fleet remained in Japanese ports. This electronic deception, combined with physical camouflage and security measures, successfully convinced American intelligence that Japanese carrier forces posed no immediate threat to Hawaii. The timing of the Pearl Harbor attack reflected careful consideration of multiple factors, including weather conditions, moon phases, and American operational patterns. December offered optimal weather for the trans-Pacific voyage, with winter storm systems providing concealment for the approaching task force. The new moon period around December 7th offered maximum darkness for the final approach, while Sunday morning timing exploited American weekend routines that left the fleet with reduced manning and relaxed security procedures. Japanese planners also calculated that early morning attacks would catch aircraft on the ground and ships at their most vulnerable anchored positions. The development of detailed attack plans for different scenarios revealed the thoroughness of Japanese operational planning. Primary emphasis was placed on attacks against aircraft carriers, which Japanese planners correctly identified as the greatest long-term threat to their Pacific operations. However, detailed contingency plans addressed alternative target priorities if carriers were absent from Pearl Harbor, with battleships and cruisers designated as secondary objectives. Additional planning addressed attacks on shore facilities, including airfields, fuel storage, and repair facilities that supported fleet operations. The coordination between the Pearl Harbor attack and simultaneous operations throughout the Pacific demonstrated the sophisticated strategic planning that characterized Japanese military thinking in 1941. The Hawaii operation was never conceived as an isolated action, but rather as the opening move in a carefully orchestrated sequence of attacks that would establish Japanese dominance throughout the Western Pacific. Operations against the Philippines, Hong Kong, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies were all timed to begin shortly after the Pearl Harbor attack, creating maximum psychological impact while preventing American forces from concentrating against any single Japanese objective. The personnel selection process for Operation Z emphasized both technical competence and psychological reliability. Pilots chosen for the attack represented the elite of Japanese naval aviation, with extensive training in carrier operations and combat experience from the ongoing war in China. However, equal attention was paid to security considerations, with all personnel subjected to intensive background investigations to prevent intelligence leaks that might compromise the operation. The selection process also considered the psychological demands of the mission, recognizing that success would require exceptional courage and discipline under combat conditions. The final preparations for the Pearl Harbor attack during November 1941 reflected the intense pressure and excitement that characterized the Japanese naval establishment as the moment of decision approached. Last-minute intelligence updates were incorporated into target assignments, while final equipment checks ensured that all aircraft and weapon systems were operating at peak efficiency. The departure of the task force from Hitokapu Bay on November 26 marked the culmination of nearly a year of intensive planning and preparation, representing one of the most ambitious naval operations ever attempted. The psychological preparation of Japanese personnel for Operation Z involved both practical training and ideological indoctrination designed to ensure peak performance under combat stress. Pilots underwent intensive briefings on American defensive capabilities and expected resistance, while also receiving spiritual preparation emphasizing the sacred nature of their mission and the honor of serving the Emperor. This combination of practical and psychological preparation reflected the Japanese military's understanding that success in combat required both technical competence and moral certainty. The maintenance and logistics arrangements for the Pearl Harbor Task Force addressed the complex requirements of keeping such a large fleet operational during extended independent operations. Each ship carried sufficient fuel, ammunition, and provisions for approximately 30 days of independent operation, while specialized vessels provided additional supplies and repair capabilities. The logistics plan also addressed medical requirements, communications equipment, and spare parts for aircraft and ships, recognizing that the task force would be completely isolated from Japanese bases throughout the operation. The weather analysis and meteorological planning for Operation Z demonstrated the sophisticated scientific support available to Japanese military operations in 1941. Meteorologists provided detailed forecasts for the entire Trans-Pacific route, identifying optimal timing for departure and arrival that would take advantage of favorable weather conditions while avoiding severe storms that might damage ships or disrupt operations. The weather analysis also addressed conditions over Pearl Harbor on the morning of the attack, predicting clear skies and calm winds that would provide ideal conditions for air operations. The deception and security measures implemented to protect Operation Z from American intelligence represented a masterpiece of operational security. Japanese forces maintained elaborate pretenses, suggesting that major naval units remained in home waters, including fake radio traffic, decoy ship movements, and carefully orchestrated shore leave policies designed to create the impression of normal peacetime activities. Simultaneously, extraordinary security measures prevented information about the real operation from leaking to American intelligence sources, with personnel compartmentalized and information restricted on a strict need-to-know basis. The final briefings conducted aboard Japanese carriers as the task force approached Hawaiian waters revealed the meticulous attention to detail that characterized Japanese planning for the Pearl Harbor attack. Squadron commanders reviewed target assignments, approach routes, and tactical procedures one final time, while individual pilots studied aerial photographs and maps of their specific objectives. These final preparations emphasized both the technical aspects of the attack and the broader strategic significance of the operation for Japan's war aims in the Pacific. The transformation of strategic concept into operational reality represented a remarkable achievement in military planning and coordination. The complexity of mounting a carrier-based attack across thousands of miles of ocean, coordinating multiple ship and aircraft types, and achieving tactical surprise against a prepared enemy required innovations in planning, training, and execution that established new standards for naval operations. The success of these preparations would be measured not in the elegance of the plans themselves, but in their ability to achieve the strategic objectives that Admiral Yamamoto had established for the operation. As Japanese aircraft prepared for launch on the morning of December 7, 1941, the culmination of nearly a year of intensive planning and preparation was finally at hand. The success or failure of Operation Z would determine not only the immediate tactical outcome at Pearl Harbor, but also the broader strategic trajectory of the Pacific War. The mechanics of surprise that Japanese planners had so carefully constructed were about to face the ultimate test of combat, with the fate of nations hanging in the balance as the sun rose over the Hawaiian Islands. The pre-dawn darkness of December 7, 1941, shrouded the waters north of Oahu in an eerie calm that belied the momentous events about to unfold. Approximately 230 miles from Pearl Harbor, the Japanese task force had achieved the impossible. 6 aircraft carriers, supported by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, had crossed 3,500 miles of Pacific Ocean undetected and now prepared to launch the most audacious naval air assault in history. The culmination of months of meticulous planning was about to transform from strategic concept to devastating reality, forever altering the course of World War II and the relationship between Japan and the United States. Aboard the flagship carrier Akagi, Commander Mitsuo Fuchida completed his final preparations as overall flight commander for the attack. The veteran pilot, handpicked by Admiral Yamamoto for his exceptional leadership abilities and tactical expertise, understood that the success of Operation Z depended not only on the months of preparation that had brought the task force to Hawaiian waters, but on the precise execution of the next few hours. As dawn approached, 183 aircraft from the 6 carriers were being readied for launch, representing the concentrated striking power of the Imperial Japanese Navy's most elite aviation units. The composition of the first attack wave reflected the sophisticated tactical planning that had characterized Japanese preparation for Pearl Harbor. 49 Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo bombers, modified with special shallow-water torpedoes, would strike the battleships moored along Ford Island. 40 Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers, armed with armor-piercing bombs converted from naval artillery shells, would target the same capital ships from high altitude. 51 additional Kates, configured as level bombers, would attack the aircraft carriers if present, or secondary targets if the carriers were absent from port. 43 Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters would provide air superiority and strafe American airfields to prevent fighter opposition. The intelligence picture available to Japanese commanders on the morning of December 7th revealed both the opportunities and limitations that would shape the attack. Recent surveillance flights and agent reports indicated that 8 battleships were present in Pearl Harbor, moored in the predictable pattern along Ford Island's east side that American sailors called Battleship Row. However, the 3 aircraft carriers of the Pacific Fleet, USS Enterprise, USS Lexington, and USS Saratoga, were absent from port, denying Japanese forces their highest priority targets. This absence of carriers would prove strategically significant, though its importance would not become apparent until later phases of the Pacific War. The launch of the first attack wave began at 6 a.m. Hawaiian time, with aircraft lifting off from carrier decks in carefully orchestrated sequence. The takeoff process, conducted in darkness with only minimal lighting to avoid detection, demonstrated the exceptional skill of Japanese carrier pilots and the sophisticated coordination that characterized their naval aviation units. Within 15 minutes, all 183 aircraft were airborne and forming up for the flight to Pearl Harbor, navigating by dead reckoning and radio beacon signals from commercial Hawaiian radio stations that continued their regular programming, unwittingly guiding the attacking force to its target. The flight to Pearl Harbor took the Japanese formation over some of the most beautiful seascape in the Pacific, though few of the pilots had attention to spare for scenic appreciation. Flying at low altitude to avoid radar detection, the attacking aircraft followed a carefully planned route that took advantage of terrain masking and weather conditions to remain undetected until the final moments before attack. The formation discipline maintained during this flight demonstrated the exceptional training and professional competence that characterized Japanese naval aviation in 1941, representing the culmination of decades of institutional development and tactical refinement. The first indication of the approaching attack came at 7:02 a.m., when the destroyer USS Ward detected and engaged a midget submarine attempting to enter Pearl Harbor. This encounter, which resulted in the sinking of the intruding vessel, provided nearly an hour's warning that hostile forces were operating in Hawaiian waters. However, the complex command structure and peacetime communications procedures of the American military prevented this warning from reaching the appropriate authorities in time to organize effective defensive measures. The failure to act on this early warning would become one of the most studied aspects of the Pearl Harbor attack, illustrating the challenges of transitioning from peacetime to wartime operational procedures. At 7:55 a.m., Commander Fuchida's aircraft appeared over the northern shores of Oahu, approaching Pearl Harbor from the most unexpected direction. American military planners had anticipated that any attack on Hawaii would come from the south, where Japanese bases in the Marshall and Caroline Islands could support such operations. The approach from the north, made possible by the audacious trans-Pacific carrier voyage, achieved complete tactical surprise and allowed Japanese aircraft to attack their targets before American defenses could respond effectively. The signal Tora, 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 transmitted by Fuchida at 7:53 a.m., became one of the most famous radio calls in military history, informing the Japanese task force that complete tactical surprise had been achieved. This coded message, meaning "Tiger, Tiger, Tiger" in Japanese, confirmed that American forces had been caught completely unprepared and that the attack could proceed according to plan without significant opposition. The psychological impact of this achievement of surprise extended far beyond its immediate tactical benefits, demonstrating Japanese capability for strategic deception and operational security that would influence American perceptions throughout the Pacific War. The initial assault on American airfields reflected the sophisticated understanding of air power dynamics that characterized Japanese tactical thinking. Rather than focusing immediately on the ships in Pearl Harbor, the first priority was neutralizing American aviation capabilities that might interfere with the main attack. At Wheeler Field, Hickam Field, and the Naval Air Station on Ford Island, Japanese fighters and dive bombers struck aircraft parked in neat rows, vulnerable formations that had been adopted as protection against sabotage rather than air attack. Within the first 10 minutes of the assault, over 180 American aircraft were destroyed or damaged, effectively eliminating any possibility of meaningful air defense. The torpedo attacks on Battleship Row represented the most technically challenging and strategically significant aspect of the Pearl Harbor assault. The specially modified torpedoes, designed to run in shallow water without burying themselves in the harbor bottom, performed exactly as intended, striking their targets with devastating effect. The USS Oklahoma, struck by multiple torpedoes within the first 5 minutes of the attack, capsized completely, trapping hundreds of sailors within its overturned hull. The USS West Virginia, also hit by multiple torpedoes, settled on an even keel in the shallow water, its crew fighting fires and flooding while under continuous attack. The destruction of the USS Arizona became the defining image of the Pearl Harbor attack and the most enduring symbol of Japanese tactical success. At 8:06 a.m., a specially modified armor-piercing bomb, dropped from high altitude by a Kate bomber, penetrated the battleship's forward deck and detonated in the forward magazine. The resulting explosion, visible for miles and felt throughout Pearl Harbor, killed 177 sailors instantly and created a fireball that rose nearly 1,000 feet into the Hawaiian sky. The Arizona's destruction demonstrated both the effectiveness of Japanese weapons and the vulnerability of American naval vessels to air attack, lessons that would reshape naval warfare throughout the Pacific conflict. The second wave of the Japanese attack, consisting of 170 aircraft launched an hour after the first, arrived over Pearl Harbor at 8:54 a.m. to find American defenses fully alert and responding. Unlike the first wave, which had achieved complete surprise, the second attack faced organized resistance from anti-aircraft guns and the few American aircraft that had managed to get airborne. However, the damage inflicted by this second wave was still significant, particularly against installations and facilities that had been secondary targets during the initial assault. The performance of American defensive measures during the Pearl Harbor attack revealed both strengths and weaknesses in the U.S. military's preparation for modern warfare. Individual acts of heroism were numerous, with sailors and soldiers manning anti-aircraft guns, despite continuing attacks and attempting to rescue comrades from damaged ships. However, the overall defensive response was hampered by peacetime command structures, inadequate communications, and the simple shock of finding themselves under attack by an enemy they had not expected to face in Hawaiian waters. The tactical execution of the Pearl Harbor attack demonstrated Japanese mastery of carrier aviation and coordinated air operations that was unmatched by any other navy in 1941. The precision of the bombing attacks, the coordination between different aircraft types, and the discipline maintained throughout the assault reflected years of training and institutional development within Japanese naval aviation. The attack also showcased innovative Japanese tactics and weapons that pushed the boundaries of what was considered possible in naval warfare, establishing new standards for carrier-based operations that would influence naval development throughout World War II. The damage assessment conducted by Japanese forces during and immediately after the attack revealed both the successes and limitations of their tactical planning. 8 battleships had been sunk or damaged, effectively eliminating American battle line strength in the Pacific for the immediate future. 3 cruisers, 3 destroyers, and numerous auxiliary vessels had also been hit, while over 180 aircraft had been destroyed on the ground. However, the absence of American aircraft carriers from Pearl Harbor meant that the most strategically significant targets had escaped damage, preserving American capability for the carrier warfare that would dominate the Pacific conflict. The human cost of the Pearl Harbor attack reflected the intensity and effectiveness of the Japanese assault. American casualties totaled 2,403 killed and 1,178 wounded, with nearly half of the deaths resulting from the destruction of the USS Arizona. Japanese losses were remarkably light, with only 29 aircraft shot down and fewer than 100 personnel killed or missing. This favorable casualty exchange demonstrated both the effectiveness of Japanese tactical planning and the advantages conferred by achieving complete strategic and tactical surprise. The decision by Admiral Nagumo not to launch a third attack wave has remained one of the most controversial aspects of the Pearl Harbor operation. Japanese forces had achieved their primary objectives within 2 hours, but significant targets remained undamaged, including the fuel storage facilities, repair shops, and submarine base that supported Pacific Fleet operations. A third attack might have extended American recovery time by months or years, but it would also have risked Japanese aircraft and personnel against fully alerted defenses. Nagumo's decision to withdraw reflected the conservative tactical thinking that would characterize Japanese naval operations throughout the war. The strategic communications aspects of the Pearl Harbor attack revealed both Japanese attention to international law and the practical limitations of diplomatic coordination during military operations. The attack was scheduled to begin approximately 30 minutes after the formal delivery of Japan's declaration of war to the American government, providing technical compliance with international legal requirements while maintaining tactical surprise. However, delays in decoding and typing the declaration in the Japanese embassy in Washington meant that the attack actually began before war was formally declared, creating the impression of treachery that would galvanize American public opinion. The immediate aftermath of the Pearl Harbor attack saw frantic activity throughout the Pacific as both Japanese and American forces adjusted to the new strategic reality. For Japan, the success of the operation opened the way for simultaneous attacks throughout the Pacific, with forces moving against the Philippines, Hong Kong, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies within hours of the Hawaiian assault. For the United States, Pearl Harbor represented both a tactical disaster and a strategic awakening, eliminating any remaining illusions about American immunity from foreign attack and mobilizing public opinion for total war against the Axis powers. The psychological impact of the Pearl Harbor attack extended far beyond its immediate military consequences. For the American public, the sneak attack became a symbol of Japanese treachery and a rallying cry for national mobilization. The phrase, "Remember Pearl Harbor," would motivate American war production and military recruitment throughout the Pacific War, transforming tactical defeat into strategic motivation for total victory. For Japan, the success of the operation validated Admiral Yamamoto's strategic thinking in the short term, demonstrating Japanese capability for innovative military operations and confirming their temporary naval superiority in the Pacific. However, beneath the celebration of tactical victory, thoughtful Japanese leaders recognized the enormous strategic gamble they had undertaken and the limited time available to achieve their broader objectives before American industrial might could be fully mobilized. The propaganda value of the Pearl Harbor attack for Japanese domestic consumption was enormous, providing concrete evidence of Japanese military superiority and validating the concept of Yamato Damashi, the spiritual strength that could overcome material disadvantages. Japanese civilians, already conditioned by years of militaristic indoctrination and nationalist fervor, viewed the attack as a justified response to American economic warfare through the oil embargo and other trade restrictions. The successful strike against the world's most powerful navy seemed to confirm Japanese beliefs about their destiny as leaders of the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. However, the long-term consequences of Pearl Harbor for Japan would prove catastrophic, transforming what had been a regional conflict in Asia into a global war against the world's greatest industrial power. The attack eliminated any possibility of negotiated peace and guaranteed that the United States would mobilize its full economic and military capacity for total victory. Admiral Yamamoto's famous prediction that he could run wild for 6 months or a year proved remarkably accurate, but his hope that early Japanese victories would convince Americans to accept a negotiated settlement was tragically misplaced. The smoke had barely cleared from Pearl Harbor when the full magnitude of Japan's strategic miscalculation began to manifest itself across the Pacific and beyond. While Japanese forces celebrated their tactical triumph and American defenders struggled to comprehend the scope of the disaster, both nations were already being drawn into a conflict whose ultimate outcome would be determined not by the brilliance of the December 7th attack, but by the fundamental economic and industrial realities that Admiral Yamamoto had understood, but hoped to overcome through audacious military action. The immediate American response to Pearl Harbor exceeded even the most pessimistic Japanese expectations, demonstrating a national unity and determination to wage total war that Japanese planners had failed to anticipate. President Franklin D. Roosevelt's address to Congress on December 8, 1941, declaring December 7th a date which will live in infamy, crystallized American public opinion and eliminated the isolationist sentiment that had previously constrained American foreign policy. The congressional vote for war, with only one dissenting voice, represented a degree of national unanimity that would sustain the American war effort through 4 years of global conflict. The transformation of American society and economy following Pearl Harbor revealed the industrial and demographic advantages that ultimately doomed Japanese hopes for victory in the Pacific War. Within months of the attack, American factories were converting from civilian to military production on a scale unprecedented in human history. The arsenal of democracy that Roosevelt had promised became reality as American shipyards began launching vessels faster than Japanese forces could sink them, while aircraft factories produced fighters and bombers in quantities that dwarfed Japanese manufacturing capacity. For Japanese strategic planners, the window of opportunity created by Pearl Harbor began closing much faster than anticipated. While the attack had indeed neutralized American battle line strength in the Pacific temporarily, the survival of the American aircraft carrier fleet, absent from Pearl Harbor on December 7th, preserved the core of American naval aviation capability. The carriers USS Enterprise, USS Lexington, and USS Saratoga, along with their experienced air groups, would form the nucleus of American resistance during the critical early months of 1942. The strategic consequences of Pearl Harbor extended far beyond the Pacific theater, fundamentally altering the global balance of power and the trajectory of World War II. Hitler's decision to declare war on the United States following Japan's attack brought America fully into the European conflict, providing Britain with the Allied support that Churchill had desperately sought. The Europe First strategy adopted by American planners meant that the full weight of American industrial capacity would be directed primarily against Germany, while Japan would face an American war effort that was essentially a secondary priority until European victory was achieved. Japanese expansion in the weeks and months following Pearl Harbor initially seemed to validate the strategic logic underlying the attack. With American naval power temporarily neutralized and European colonial powers focused on the war against Germany, Japanese forces achieved spectacular successes throughout Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific. Hong Kong fell on December 25, 1941, followed by Singapore on February 15, 1942, and the Dutch East Indies by March 1942. These victories provided Japan with access to the oil, rubber, and strategic materials that had motivated the entire Pacific War. However, the ease of these early conquests masked fundamental weaknesses in Japanese strategic planning that would prove fatal as the war continued. The concept of a defensive perimeter stretching from the Aleutians to the Solomons was beyond Japan's capacity to maintain against determined American attack, particularly once American industrial production reached full capacity. Japanese naval construction, constrained by limited resources and industrial capacity, could not match the pace of American shipbuilding, which would eventually produce over 100 aircraft carriers during the war. The human cost of Japanese strategic overextension became apparent as early as April 1942, when the Doolittle raid demonstrated American capability to strike the Japanese home islands, despite Pearl Harbor's tactical success. While the material damage inflicted by 16 B-25 bombers was minimal, the psychological impact was enormous, forcing Japanese leaders to recognize that their island nation remained vulnerable to American attack. The diversion of resources to home defense and the acceleration of offensive operations to establish a more secure defensive perimeter would stretch Japanese forces beyond their capacity to maintain. The Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942 marked the beginning of the end for Japanese naval dominance in the Pacific, demonstrating that American forces were recovering more quickly than Japanese planners had anticipated. While technically a Japanese tactical victory, the battle cost Japan aircraft and experienced pilots that could not be easily replaced, while American losses were quickly made good through accelerated production and training programs. The strategic balance was shifting inexorably in America's favor as Japanese advantages in training and equipment eroded through combat attrition. The decisive turning point came at the Battle of Midway in June 1942, where Admiral Yamamoto's attempt to complete the destruction of American naval power resulted instead in a catastrophic Japanese defeat. The loss of 4 fleet carriers and their air groups eliminated Japan's offensive capability in the Pacific and marked the end of the expansion phase that Pearl Harbor was supposed to enable. Yamamoto's strategic gamble, brilliant in conception and initially successful in execution, had ultimately led to the destruction of the naval aviation force that had made Pearl Harbor possible. The long-term consequences of Pearl Harbor for Japanese society and politics were as profound as the military implications. The attack had committed Japan irrevocably to total war against opponents whose combined resources vastly exceeded Japanese capacity, ensuring that the conflict would continue until one side achieved complete victory. The cultural and psychological factors that had driven Japanese expansion, concepts of divine mission, racial superiority, and spiritual strength overcoming material disadvantage, proved inadequate against the sustained industrial and military pressure that America and its allies brought to bear. The strategic deception that had made Pearl Harbor possible also created long-term disadvantages for Japanese diplomacy and international relations. The sneak attack label attached to the Pearl Harbor assault provided the United States with a powerful propaganda tool that justified total war aims and unlimited mobilization against Japan. American public opinion, initially divided about involvement in foreign wars, became unified in support of unconditional Japanese surrender, eliminating any possibility of the negotiated peace that Japanese leaders had hoped to achieve through early military success. The economic warfare that had driven Japan to attack Pearl Harbor ultimately achieved American objectives through different means. The oil embargo and trade restrictions imposed by the United States in 1941 had been designed to halt Japanese expansion without war. But Japan's military response to these pressures created the conditions for total economic blockade and eventual Japanese defeat. The submarine campaign waged by American forces against Japanese shipping achieved the economic strangulation that peaceful means had failed to accomplish. The technological and tactical innovations developed for the Pearl Harbor attack established precedents that would influence naval warfare throughout the conflict and beyond. The emphasis on carrier aviation, coordinated airstrikes, and offensive operations became standard doctrine for all major navies, while the specialized weapons and techniques developed for shallow water attacks found applications in later amphibious operations. However, Japanese advantages in these areas proved temporary as American forces adapted and improved upon Japanese innovations with superior resources and industrial capacity. The intelligence failures that enabled Pearl Harbor to achieve tactical surprise reflected broader problems in American military planning and inter-service coordination that were corrected through the harsh lessons of war. The establishment of unified command structures, improved intelligence sharing, and enhanced defensive preparations ensured that no future attack could achieve the complete surprise that had made December 7th possible. These improvements in American military organization and doctrine provided long-term advantages that more than compensated for the temporary setbacks caused by Pearl Harbor. The demographic and cultural factors that influenced Japanese strategic thinking in 1941 ultimately proved inadequate for sustaining total war against opponents with vastly greater human and material resources. Japanese concepts of spiritual superiority and divine mission, while providing short-term motivation and tactical advantages, could not overcome the fundamental mathematical realities of industrial production and population that favored the United States and its allies. The Bushido tradition that emphasized death before dishonor created psychological advantages in individual combat, but proved counterproductive in a conflict that required flexible adaptation to changing strategic circumstances. The global implications of Pearl Harbor extended far beyond the immediate participants, reshaping international relations and establishing patterns that would influence world politics for decades. The entry of the United States into World War II as a fully committed belligerent accelerated the transformation of America from regional power to global hegemon, while Japan's defeat and occupation established American dominance in the Pacific that continues to the present day. The attack that was intended to secure Japanese regional hegemony ultimately created the conditions for American global leadership. The lessons learned from Pearl Harbor influenced military doctrine and strategic thinking throughout the Cold War and beyond, establishing principles about the relationship between tactical success and strategic objectives that remain relevant today. The attack demonstrated both the possibilities and limitations of preemptive warfare, showing that tactical brilliance could achieve temporary advantages but could not overcome fundamental disadvantages in resources, geography, and industrial capacity. These lessons would influence American strategic thinking about surprise attack, nuclear warfare, and the relationship between military action and political objectives throughout the second half of the 20th century. The reconciliation between Japan and the United States following World War II, remarkable in its completeness and durability, was built on the shared recognition that the Pearl Harbor attack and its aftermath had served neither nation's long-term interests. The transformation of Japan from militaristic empire to peaceful democracy accomplished under American occupation and guidance, created the foundation for a strategic partnership that has served both nations well in the post-war period. The memory of Pearl Harbor, rather than dividing the two countries permanently, became part of a shared history that strengthened their alliance against common threats. The strategic assessment of Operation Z reveals a complex mixture of tactical brilliance and strategic miscalculation that continues to fascinate military historians and strategic analysts. Admiral Yamamoto's innovative thinking about carrier warfare, offensive operations, and the concentration of force established principles that remain valid today, while his understanding of American industrial capacity and the limited window available for Japanese action proved remarkably prescient. However, his assumptions about American political will and the possibility of negotiated peace after military defeat reflected fundamental misunderstandings of democratic political culture and national character that doomed Japanese hopes for victory from the outset. The Pearl Harbor attack thus stands as one of history's most significant examples of the relationship between tactical success and strategic failure. The operation succeeded brilliantly in its immediate objectives, neutralizing American naval power in the Pacific and enabling Japanese expansion throughout Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific. However, these tactical achievements ultimately served American rather than Japanese strategic interests, providing the United States with the motivation and justification for total mobilization against the Axis powers while ensuring that Japan would face the full weight of American industrial and military capacity in a prolonged war of attrition that could have only one outcome. As the sun set on December 7, 1941, the world had been forever changed by a single morning's violence in the Pacific. The Pearl Harbor attack, conceived by Admiral Yamamoto as a desperate gamble to secure Japanese dominance in East Asia, had instead set in motion forces that would ultimately destroy the Japanese Empire and establish American hegemony throughout the Pacific region. The tactical brilliance that enabled fewer than 400 aircraft to neutralize the battle line of the world's most powerful navy could not overcome the strategic realities that would determine the war's ultimate outcome. The human cost of this strategic miscalculation would be measured not only in the 2,400 American lives lost at Pearl Harbor, but in the millions of casualties that would follow during 4 years of total war across the Pacific. Japanese cities would burn under American bombing raids, culminating in the atomic destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki that finally convinced Emperor Hirohito to accept unconditional surrender. The Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere that Pearl Harbor was meant to secure would collapse entirely, leaving Japan occupied and transformed under American guidance. Yet from this catastrophic failure would emerge one of history's most remarkable transformations. The Japan that rose from the ashes of World War II, guided by democratic principles and committed to peaceful development, would become one of America's most important allies and partners. The attack that was intended to drive America from the Pacific ultimately created the foundation for a strategic partnership that has endured for over 8 decades, demonstrating that even the most destructive conflicts can give way to cooperation and mutual understanding. The legacy of Pearl Harbor thus transcends the immediate tactical and strategic consequences of December 7, 1941. It serves as the enduring reminder of the complex relationship between military action and political objectives, the dangers of strategic overreach, and the possibility of reconciliation even after the most devastating conflicts. Admiral Yamamoto's gamble failed, but the world that emerged from that failure was ultimately more stable and prosperous than the one that existed before the first Japanese aircraft appeared over Oahu on that fateful Sunday morning. The echoes of Pearl Harbor continue to resonate in contemporary international relations, strategic planning, and the ongoing partnership between Japan and the United States. December 7th, 1941, remains indeed a date which will live in infamy, but it has become infamy transformed into understanding, conflict transformed into cooperation, and enemies transformed into allies. This may be the most remarkable legacy of all from the morning that changed everything. Thank you for joining us on this comprehensive examination of Pearl Harbor from the Japanese perspective. If this documentary has deepened your understanding of this pivotal moment in history, please like this video, subscribe to our channel for more in-depth historical analyses, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Remember to hit the notification bell to stay updated with our latest releases exploring the complex narratives that shaped our world.